The Commerce Committee on the 2012-13 financial review of the New Zealand Tourism Board being noted. Those of that opinion will please say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. I understand that the next entity members wish to debate is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. The question is that the report of the Finance and Expenditure Committee on the 2011-2012 financial review of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand be noted.
Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to take a call. I want to reflect on the mandate of the Reserve Bank and why, in the view of the Labour Party, we as a Parliament should update that to cater for the challenges of today. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand hasn't had a current account surplus for 40 years. For 40 years we've run a current account deficit. Whenever I say that, for some reason Mr. Joyce finds that funny. But he seems to think that getting back to about -3% of GDP as a current account deficit is the best that it can ever get. It's the best that it'll ever get under the national government, because on these big calls they're always followers, they're never leaders. It wasn't them that introduced the Reserve Bank Act in the first place. It wasn't them that introduced the Cullen Fund. They opposed it. They now say it's good. In fact, they called it a dog. It wasn't them that introduced KiwiSaver. These long-term changes that make New Zealand a better place are generally brought about by the Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, the last time New Zealand had a current account deficit, we had terms of trade that were good. But you know what? They weren't quite as good as the terms of trade that we've just had. So comparison with 40 years ago, when we had terms of trade this good, New Zealand had a 2% current account surplus. We still have a deficit that's around 3%. It might get a wee bit under 3% by the time it starts going out again, but then it's going to go back out to over 3%. Mr. Speaker, every year that New Zealand has a current account deficit, it plugs the gap in either one of two ways, generally a combination of both. It either borrows more money from overseas lenders, or it sells assets that were previously New Zealand owned to overseas owners. And as a consequence, the burden of New Zealand's economy to pay interest or dividend flows to those overseas lenders and overseas owners grows every year. Mr. Speaker, of course the control of inflation is important, and prior to our announcements there was concern amongst some of the bank economists and some of the academic economists that we were going to lose that grounding, the target to control inflation. But we haven't done that. Actually, Mr. Joyce, he chortles away there on the other side, but he's a man of so little vision that he doesn't get the subtlety of any policy. He thinks the way to actually go about policy is to employ more than 50 spin doctors at MB. That's his view of policy. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we can cause the Reserve Bank to approach monetary policy in a way which best achieves external balance over the cycle, and so that's what we've said it should do. Mr. Speaker, if we do that, we will also get the Reserve Bank encouraging better policy outcomes from the government. We know that the reason that interest rates are going up at the moment is because we've got enormous house price inflation in Auckland at a time when general price inflation is low. The failure of government policy around housing is responsible for those interest rates going up higher than they would otherwise need to go. Mr. Speaker, part of that imbalance in the economy is caused by biases in our tax system, notably the absence of a capital gains tax taxing speculative property purchases. Now, the National Party rattles on that we've already got a capital gains tax. That's not true. We do tax as income some traders in property, but the vast majority of investors in property who buy a property and then sell it at a profit do not pay any tax on the economic gains. And Mr. Speaker, the IMF, the OECD, the Treasury and the Reserve Bank all agree these cause imbalances. One of the reasons why the government gets away with not doing anything to address this, which is plainly in the interest of the economy, even if it's not in the interest of the minority of New Zealanders for whom this national government plainly govern and whose interests they prefer, the reason they get away with it is that the Reserve Bank is never, under its current mandate, really strongly incentivised to saying, well, look, actually, if you don't introduce a capital gains tax, we're going to have to push up interest rates, because that's effectively the trade-off that we have in New Zealand at the moment, and yet that's not exposed under current settings. So, Mr Speaker, the changes that we propose to monetary policy would be one of the ways that New Zealand could keep our interest rates lower for longer. We have interest rates that throughout the economic cycle are higher than other countries. I'm not talking about the variation within an economic cycle, the timing of which will be different in New Zealand compared with overseas countries. I'm talking about overall New Zealand interest rates are about 1.5% to 2% higher than they are in Australia. And the difference in respect of some other countries is even higher. Mr Speaker, we will not get over our current account deficit. We will not get over we will not be able to increase our wages in New Zealand and grow our export economy unless we address these problems.
I call the Honourable Minister Stephen Joyce.
Mr Chair, well, it's an interesting little